Got it. Ah, look at that. Hi, thank y'all so much. And you know a little bit about me. I also have a few pictures just to share about myself. So like Chad said, I am married. My husband and I reside in Denham Springs, and we don't have any children, but we do have 2 pets. And I was a COVID graduate with my master's. I went back while I was working full time, but you all know what I mean whenever you're working in a church setting, you're doing a lot of hats. You're wearing a lot of hats. All right, we're gonna refocus in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stay with your partner. And now we're going to touch on some questions, some of our thoughts on some questions that are TOB related. Okay, so here we go. Here's your first question. What is the purpose of the human person? Here's our question. Why do we have bodies? Why do we have bodies? I was looking through, you're probably all familiar, right, with this wonderful book with the orange cover, TOB for Teens. I don't know if some of you are familiar with that one. And that's what I was just starting to teach at the time, and that was one of like the supplemental, but we weren't like putting it in the classroom yet. But I remember looking through it, I was like, this is great. I was like, but it's all about like abstinence, because it was for teens, of course. And so what a great way to approach abstinence, and I kind of put it aside because it wasn't in my curriculum. I'm like, oh, great, and then I like didn't think much about it for the next 19 years. And when I went back to grad school, I had a teacher who made us read John Paul's actual writing, and it looks like this, right? And what I discovered in this book was the abstinence application is a really good one, but it is so much more than that. And for me, I was a cradle Catholic. I've always been Catholic and always practicing. And I believed, some things I didn't understand, but I believed because I love the church, right? And when I read this book, I was like, oh my gosh, this is why we're Catholic. This is why we have bodies. This is why, this is why we exist. Like, these are the questions that John Paul intended to answer for us in and through theology of the body. And I was in shock that's what it was. And I remember when I finished the course, I remember thinking to myself, because I'm a teacher, I was like, I cannot know this and like not tell other people, because I'm like, everybody should know this, right? Every Catholic, every person should know this. And so I wrote one course and proposed it to my principal at the time. And I teach over at St. Joseph's Academy in Baton Rouge. And I said, I think we need a class that teaches from this book, so girls will understand, And she was like, she didn't know anything about theology of the body. She was like, I trust you, we'll roll the dice. And so that was 6 years ago. I'm on my 6th year teaching it there. And that one course, during that one course, I had the parents of those students approach me saying, we want to learn what you're teaching our daughters. And so then one of those parents was a CEO at a company, and so my first adult courses were like in his conference room in his office, And then it just kept expanding, and now that one course I wrote so long ago is mandated in the Diocese of Baton Rouge and Lake Charles and things like that. So anyway, and that has developed now into an international ministry. So that's kind of how it came about. That's kind of my TOB story and journey. And so I remember, though, when I was reading that book for the first time, the only thing I took, I took lots of stuff from my parents when I moved out, but the most important thing that I took with me when I moved out was this encyclopedic dictionary. Y'all remember encyclopedias? I don't know if they're around anymore, but anyway, it's literally like this tall and about that thick. And I was like, I'm gonna need that, because it was like an encyclopedic dictionary. It had all the etymology of words, and I was like, oh yeah. So I remember I had that book and my dictionary open as I was trying to read my reading assignments, and I'd be reading it and literally crying. I'd be sobbing like, I don't know what this means. I'm looking for the words in the dictionary, right? I'm just sobbing, crying. Because reading what he wrote is really difficult for most people, right? Because if you consider who he is, right? He had, not only did he have special gifts, I think, right? And but he spoke, I think it was like 12 languages, and he had doctorate, and he had been a teacher, and he was Pope, so you're looking at a man that has, a lot of depth to him. And so one thing that I realized was that when I started to teach it, there were some fundamental things that, whenever you're reading an author, that author, it has an audience in mind, and then they have, they make maybe some assumptions that their audience is gonna, know some certain things before they read their book, John Paul's no different. And what I realized, though, I was using these terms he writes about in the book, and everybody was just like, I don't know. They're like, we have no idea, we're lost. And so I realized, I was like, wait a minute, he's assuming we know some stuff that I don't think we know, right? So I put together some foundational principles, which I'm going to share with you today, and then we're going to do a quick overview of his teaching in the first 2/3 of that book. Yeah, so hang on to your seats. It's going to be really fast. Okay, and then I am going to take you through a process of planning a lesson based on one concept that we covered today, and show you the pedagogy, which is a way of teaching, that I've put together that is based on what theology of the body is all about. And so it's like, kind of like embodying what John Paul's doing to be able to teach the subject to others. So that's our plan, okay? But let's start with some really fundamentals, right? I'm gonna go through pretty quick. I don't think it's possible to take one TOB workshop or course or whatever it is and take in all that TOB is. Okay, because it's really, really a lot. Okay, so that's why going over it again and again is so helpful, because each time we do, it goes deeper and deeper and deeper, right? And more understanding. Okay, but what is it? So John Paul he didn't even give us this book, by the way. This was compiled. He gave TOB as speeches, which you might already know, at the Wednesday audience. So if we were in Rome, we probably wouldn't be doing this. But anyway, if we were in Rome and we went on a Wednesday to St. Peter's Square, we walk into the square and the Pope just goes to his window. I have a picture of it right there. That's the Pope, the tiny white dot at the top. And he just goes to his window and gives a speech, right? And anybody that's in the square can just listen to it. And so this is how he delivered theology of the body to the church, right? And he said, in his own words, in his writing, he says, I wish to establish an adequate anthropology of the human person. This was his goal, and he was doing that in preparation for a gathering of bishops called a synod. And he was asking the bishops to meet to discuss what he said he saw problems happening that were affecting the family. Now, John Paul started these speeches in 1979, but he wrote them before that. I'm like, he's seeing problems? I don't know. Sometimes I wonder what he would write if he was here today, But yeah, so he saw a problem with the way we were understanding human beings. That's what he saw, right? And so he wanted to write Theology of the Body to give us this anthropology. Now, he accomplishes this by an exegesis of Scripture. Because John Paul, and when he wants to explain about the human person, he wants to look with Jesus, where Jesus looked to talk about family, right? And so he goes there, and then he goes back to where, in the Scriptures, to wherever Jesus talks about it. And that's his method. That's how he does that. Okay, so We're almost ready to dive in, but we need one more thing to happen before we really get into this. And that is our disposition, right? Because whenever we talk about what is a human person, why do we have bodies, in our culture today, that is controversial, right? If we say the human person is male and female, that's controversial now, right? And we might have ourselves or loved ones who might be struggling with some of the things addressed in TOB. And sometimes there's some confusion about what it means to encounter those persons who are struggling, because there are real people really suffering, right? And we wonder, or I know it's sometimes confusing, a question mark for me, like, how do I love them, but also stay faithful to what the church is asking, right, and teaching? So I'm hoping this little survey we're gonna do is gonna help us to put our minds and our hearts in that disposition that you'll see in a moment. Okay, so if you are a parent, please stand up if you're a parent. Stand up. Now, if you're not a parent, don't worry, neither am I. And so this analogy is still gonna work. Okay, all right, now parents, I would like you to remain standing. If for your children you established some expectations and rules for them to follow, please remain standing. Oh, good parents, okay. All right, whew. One day somebody's gonna sit down on that and it's gonna be like really awkward. Okay, all right. So also remain standing. If your children 100% of the time meet your expectations and follow your rules. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You are good parents. Okay, all right. Now, parents, I want you to stand up again if when your child fails to follow your rules and expectations, you love them less. Oh, thank God. Okay. All right. Yes. Okay. That's right. All right. Sometimes we think of the church as this institution that's over there handing down the rules and expectations on us, right? But what we're missing, I think, sometimes when we discuss difficult things that theology body brings up, we're missing that that's not the nature of the church. Is the church a human institution being run by humans? It is that, but it's not either or, it's both and. It is that plus. The church in her nature is a bride of Christ and a mother. She's a parent. And her job is to give us the rules and the expectations. And why do we do that? Why do you give your children rules? You want them to be like a good person, right? You want them to learn to love other people, not be selfish, all these things, right? You want them to experience the fullness of who and what they could be. So does our mother, the church. She wants us to know the fullness of what it means to be human. She wants to give us the fullness, but she already knows not even one of us is gonna be 100% on it every time. So like a good parent, right, she gives us the sacrament of reconciliation. You see, Jesus already knew. Here's what I want for you. Here's how you you flourish as a human person. Okay, you're gonna fall, right? So I wanna be reconciled to you. That is what a parent does, and that's what the church does for us. And so when we hit some of these topics, especially in some examples that I'll be using, and you feel yourself triggered, because you might, we have to remember the disposition with which the church is offering these teachings to us. She's not saying you already have to be there. She's saying, hey, I see you struggling to get there, and here's how you're gonna be helped. That is what a good parent does, right? Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, what is Christian anthropology? Anthropology is the study of the human person, right? To say Christian anthropology, this is a kind of anthropology, by the way, that John Paul II says makes it an adequate anthropology for the human person, a Christian one. Right? And what that means is we want to look at who and what the human person is through the lens of Christ, right? We cannot take in who we are unless we know Christ. And the more we know Jesus, the better we know ourselves. I'm going to give some examples of that later, but that's what Christian anthropology is. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how John Paul writes Theology of the Body. The first thing we have to mention is something called phenomenology, which is really fun to say. But it's a complicated word, an official philosophical word, that simply means the study of conscious experience. That's what it means. Phenomenology was a particular kind of philosophy that was just coming forth in the academics when John Paul was studying. And he became like one of those first phenomenologists. And one thing now remember, you're studying persons' conscious experiences, okay? And so what he did that was different from his contemporaries, also putting forth this kind of thinking, whenever his contemporaries said, we're going to study the conscious experience of the person, and then that's going to be all that's true. That's where they went with it. But John Paul said, no. Truth is not just your experience. That's right. There's objective truth. So at the cathedral, I used to live here. I don't know if I said that, but anyway, I consider Lafayette Diocese my home diocese. And I came to UL to college, and then I loved it so much I just stayed. I even got married in Milton. My mom was so mad at me. She's like, "You're not gonna get married in the church that you were raised in?" I was like, "No." Okay, because my home is in Lafayette. Okay, but anyway, so I was here for a long time, and imagine the oak tree of the cathedral. Okay, you've all seen it, I'm sure. That thing is massive, right? Have you ever tried to stand on one side and you don't even know somebody's on the other side of it? Yeah, okay. It's because it's so massive. So let's say that we are gonna go to the tree. I'm standing on one side and you're standing on the other, right? And the objective truth that is real, no matter what my experience is, no matter what I think, right? The tree is objectively really there, right? That's an objective truth. Now, on my side, let's say I see beautiful bark and branches flourishing, right? It's beautiful. But on your side, you see some bark peeling away and some of the leaves are turning brown and the branches are starting to fall out. And then you notice a scorch mark, right? You see, what just happened there is you and I just experienced an objective truth, right? And our subjective experiences of that truth were different. Same truth. Experiences are different, right? But notice what we did not do. We have not yet formed an opinion about that experience. See, our brains go so fast that as soon as we experience something, we automatically are going to how I feel about it, what I think about it, and what I'm going to say in response. Okay, that's not a good thing sometimes. Okay, but anyway. We don't even notice that we had the experience and then we form the opinion. But see, that's how the brain works. It just works super fast for us, right? So John Paul, when he writes Theology of the Body, he is not studying anybody's opinion. No opinion. We never hear Adam and Eve say, man, God is so mean. He won't even let us eat from that tree, right? We don't hear that. We don't hear their opinions. What we hear in Genesis is their experiences. That's what we hear, okay? So what John Paul is doing, he wants to study what would have been the experiences of the first humans. That's where he's going to start, right? What are the experiences? Not the opinions, right? And when John Paul uses the word subject or subjective, which we're going to get to in a little bit, he does not mean, because usually we think that means what? That's subjective. What does that tell you about what the person's saying? It's your opinion, not what it means. That's not what subjective means. Subjective means of the subject. The subject is what part of a sentence? The noun, right? The subject is the person, place, or thing, right? In our case, person. So when John Paul uses the term subjective, he's always meaning the experience of the human person. That's what he means, okay? Not their opinions. Okay, so John Paul structures this teaching of Theology Body into a triptych. How many of y'all heard this before? The triptych. Good, okay. Let's look at what it is. All right, so, okay. This is a famous triptych called the Cerulean Triptych. Triptychs are works of art that are arranged in 3 connected panels. And they're connected because they're meant to tell a story, okay? So when we look at this triptych, what story is it telling, do you think? The burial and what? That last one is kind of hard to see, but Jesus is in the red robe at the back. Resurrection. This is the Paschal mystery. That's the story it's telling, right? And you need all three of those panels to understand the story, right? But what if I cover up that last panel? Now what's the story? Death. Jesus is some guy that died. We have no faith. You see, you had to have all three parts of the panel to get the complete picture, right? The same is true with John Paul's triptych. He writes in a triptych. And he says, if we want to understand what a human person is, then we have to have all three parts of the human story. So he writes our story as a triptych at the beginning of TOB. And he says we got to look at our past. And if the past of all humans is in Genesis, right? So he says we got to see in Genesis, and particularly before the fall. Because see, before the fall is how God intended to make the human person, and right? So we had to look before the fall, and he calls that in the beginning. Then he says, then we got to talk about the man or the human of history, right? History. Any person from the fall, including Adam and Eve, they get to be in two triptych parts. From the fall until the end of time is part two of the triptych. It's historical means everything that happens in history. That's what it means. And so he looks now at our present situation as fallen, but then there was a really big event because we were fallen, nobody could get into heaven, and then what happened? That's right, Jesus happened, right? He was incarnate, he died for us, and then he rose from the dead, right? All of that happened in time. He came into time. That's where he did that. He's in the second part of the triptych too. And when I die and you die, if Jesus hasn't come back yet, you're going to be in the second part of the triptych too. And everyone who lives after you until the end of time. Because what happens at the end of time? Jesus returns, right? And time, as we know it, is over. No more time, right? And so when Jesus returns, that's our future. That's our future. So John Paul examines each part of that. And he says, we cannot understand ourselves as human persons unless we see that whole picture, the whole story. Okay, so we are going to look at now more precisely what is the problem that that he said, oh, sorry, I forgot about Mike, that he said we are dealing with, the problem, okay? And we're gonna do a little exercise about the problem. Okay, so you're gonna close your eyes for a moment, and I want you to imagine, as clearly as you can in your mind's eye, a human soul. And whenever you see it, you can open your eyes. The answer that I get everywhere I go to do this, I saw either a ball of light, a light, okay? My favorite answer that I've ever gotten, this is from a teenage girl in my high school class. Like, it was real intense. I think we're taking it very seriously, the picturing, and she opens her eyes. I'm like, what'd you see? And she's like, smoke. I was like, I don't know what that says for your soul. I'm sorry, but, I was like, yikes. Okay, I like to put my picture up there. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. I'm sorry. Okay, so y'all know the game Pac-Man? So we always see the little ghost. Whenever I first would do this all the time, I would see the little ghost. Okay, that was kind of a trick question because it illustrates the problem that John Paul says needs to be addressed if we're going to understand the human person. And it's called body-soul dualism. How many is dual? Two, always two, right? So body-soul dualism is a perception or an understanding of the human person that says our bodies are separate realities from our souls. So the soul and the body are two separate realities, right? Two separate, keep that in mind, two separate realities. And he said, whenever we see the person this way, there's a tendency to one of two extremes, okay? So these two things on the board, right, on the whatever that is right now, those are extremes, okay? Those are extremes. We can fall anywhere in between those, and if you're messed up like me, you might sometimes be on this extreme and sometimes on this extreme. Okay, all right, so the first extreme he talks about, which will feel most familiar to us, and by the way, let's check our bias heart disposition, hard topic on the horizon. Whenever we talk about, this is most common in our culture, the libertine view, is the view of the human person, same problem. The soul and the body are not the same reality, right? And so the libertine says, I am a soul. That's the real part of me, the soul. And the body is something that I use or own. So therefore, since I own it, what do we do with stuff we own? Hopefully we take care of it, but do we have to? No. It's mine. I can do whatever I want with it because it's mine. I own it, right? So it reduces the body to like just some property that I have, right? But my soul is the real me. What's an example of this? My body, my choice. It's my body. I can do whatever I want with it. Never mind, it's not even their body. Okay, anyway, that's a whole different session. Okay, but we see the libertine view is literally the abortion slogan. Literally the abortion slogan. Issues of gender. My soul is this, but my body is this, right? Okay, then there's the puritanical extreme. Now, same problem, the body and the soul are not the same reality. Right? But the body, the soul is still the real me, but the body is a hindrance to my sanctification. The body's gonna make me do bad things. So the puritanical view blames the body for the evil or for the wrong or for that, right? I'll give you some examples of this. This one's harder in our culture, but I teach a group in the Philippines on the computer. I didn't go there yet. And they struggle more with the puritanical than the liberty, because they're in a whole different, culture. Anyway, so an example. Have you seen the movie Footloose, the new one or the old one? What can they not do? Why? Because if you move your body like that, tell them what your kids are going to do next, right? You can't trust the body in that. One that will hit home, don't raise your hand, because this has happened to everybody in here, I am sure of it. You're at work, and you have some coworkers, a man and a woman, and they're married to people outside of work, other people, right? They're not married to each other, and they are always together. They run to each other's offices, they have inside jokes, they eat lunch together every day. Pretty soon, what's the rumor? Oh yeah, they're definitely having an affair. John Paul says the puritanical view of the body, of the human person, casts suspicion on the body, as if it is something bad, right? Casts suspicion. Okay, now, so that's what he saw going on, right? And that's what he wanted to address in Theology of the Body. Okay, now, you might feel like, Chad said we're not going to be drinking from a fire hydrant, but we might a little bit. So bear with me if that happens in your experience. You don't have to process it all today. Okay, so all right, here we go. Foundational principles. This is what I told you that I think we need to know before we can understand what he's saying, right? So I came up with 4. The first one is body-soul integration, right? So if the body and the soul are not two realities, that means they're one reality. Right? So if I'm imagining the soul as something separate from the body, oops, right? Instead, and this is still separate, it's an analogy though, you just kind of have to go with me on this. Okay, the soul, by the definition, right, that St. Thomas Aquinas, it's not the only definition, but like when I went to the seminary for school, we had to read the Summa, St. Thomas Aquinas, right? It's the most accepted definition. Oh wait, there's a good story that goes with this. I'll tell you what it is. Okay. for a short time, I served as a department chair in my school where I teach now. And I remember we hired a first-year teacher, and I worked at an all-girls school, okay? And this teacher was male, not that it kind of matters. Okay, anyway, it matters because the girls didn't take it well, you know what I'm saying? Okay, so they do scripture. So they're talking about Genesis, and a girl in the class asked the question that probably we have dreaded before. Do dogs have souls? What do you think? Do dogs have souls? Yes. Yeah, you see the confusion though, right? He said no. And then there was mayhem and pandemonium. The girls started crying, sobbing. They took out their phones. They started texting their moms. They had to go see the counselor. I mean, it was bad. It was bad. And I was like, oh my gosh. Okay, well, there's a nuance here. There's a nuance here that we don't often communicate in these situations, right? And the same girl 2 years later was in my class, and we started going over this, and she was like, do dogs have souls? I was like, oh no, she's still trying to trip us up. Okay, anyway. But Thomas's definition of soul is going to help us. The soul, according to St. Thomas, is the life-giving principle of an organism. So for Thomas, anything alive is going to have a life-giving principle. It's going to have a soul. Otherwise, how is the dog jumping, barking, right? It's got to be alive, right? So that would go for animals, plants, us. It's the life-giving principle. Now, here's the caveat. Not every soul is the same kind of soul, right? Because we know humans have lots of things that things under us do not have. Like rational thinking, free will, right? And so things that are alive that don't have rational souls, they cannot be united to God in the way that we can. And how do we know that humans have this? Because God made us in his image and likeness, and we were the only creatures he did that for. Okay, so we're going to talk more about that, okay? But I remember, and this girl, when she asked me, I explained that to her, and she was like, well, I still don't like it, but I understand. I was like, well, as long as you understand, that's my job. Okay, all right, so John Paul says that what we have to remember is that a person is not a duality. A person is not two separate realities, a soul and a body. The definition of a human person is an embodied soul. So if my soul would leave my body right now, what am I? Dead. If my soul is a separate reality from my body, then I have died. Right? This irked Thomas Aquinas so much that he actually says in one part, he questions, he's like, are dead people even souls, even human anymore because they don't have their bodies? I don't agree with him going that far, but you know what I'm saying? He's like, no, a human being is a union, an integration of body-soul, an embodied soul. Because there are other rational souls that don't and never will have bodies. What are they? Angels. You see, to be human means that you are a union or an embodied soul. That's what it means, right? Okay. Second foundational principle. Okay. Take a deep breath. Your mind might be a little full now, but we're about to overload it. Okay, here we go. Somebody tell me, what do you think of when you hear the word nature? What do you think of? Outside. Okay, I'm so glad you said that. All right, creation, right? A beautiful landscape. Okay, well in TOB, nope, not what it is at all. As a matter of fact, in theology, we would call this creation. We would not call it nature because nature means something totally different. Nature is the being or essence of something. Nature is what something is. Okay, so what is the nature of this object? Chair. In philosophy, it's chairness. But anyway, I don't know why. We'll just call it chair. Okay. It's a chair. You're right. How do you know that this is a chair? because you sit in it. It's made to be sat upon. That's what it's made for. That is how our mind, it's called apprehending essences, right? That's how we take in what things are. We know what the purpose of it is, and therefore I know what it is. And what it is its nature, right? If I had the podium down here, I think it's wooden. Okay. And I said, what's the essence of this thing? We would say podium. But what if I lit it on fire and it turned to ashes? Then what is it? Ashes. I've destroyed the essence of it, right? Okay, so nature is all about what something is, and we know what it is when we know what it's for, why it was made, right? Okay, now we have to know, it's the wrong way. We have to know something else about nature also. Not that. Okay. Who made natures? Who made things or created? Who's the creator? God, creator of all natures. Okay? He has in mind whether or not, I don't know if we should go that far. Okay. He is responsible for all of creation because he makes all the natures. Okay, y'all with me still? Nod if you're like, okay, I'm with you. Yes? Not with me? Oh, okay. Some of you are not nodding. Okay, so God makes them all. Now, when God makes something, or in our case, us, right? He builds into the essence that thing's purpose. And heading toward its purpose is also there. I'll give you an example. I am horrible at keeping plants alive. Like bad. They all die. I don't know why, but every plant. My husband bought me a plant that was advertised as unkillable. It died. It took longer, but it died because I just am horrible with it. Okay, so I had this plant one time, and I had it kind of like under the patio, in a like shady area, and I noticed the plant began to get brown in the part that was shaded, and then the green part was like growing sideways toward the sun, like with the sunlight. I was like, wow, right, okay, it still died. But anyway, that is a good example of nature and how God makes natures. That plant was everything that exists wants to keep on existing. That's part of everything created. That's part of its nature that God gave us. That plant wanted to keep existing. It's like, I don't know, I think of it as like a program. The plant this is its purpose. To live and reproduce is its purpose. And so it's trying to do that. Why? Because of a term we call ordered. Now, if we wanted to get to California from here, and we were going to take a train, what direction does the train have to go in? West. Because that's the train that is ordered to our destination. I could get on another train, but I won't be ending up in California if I go east or north, right? So when God makes a nature, he makes the nature with its already headed in the direction of its purpose. This is why the Catechism calls sin a disorder. A disorder. Because sin is something that I choose to do with my free will that puts me on a different track than my purpose. Which my purpose as a human person, of course, is union with God in heaven, right? That's why the Catechism says sin is a disorder. It's not going to get me there. And that idea that in my being, right, that I am made to achieve my purpose, right, we call that the natural law. I've written my law in their hearts. He made us with a purpose to be united to him, and then he gave us the map or the track. And at the beginning of our lives, he sets us on the track. And our job is to keep it ordered to our purpose. To keep ourselves ordered through our free will choices, right? Next principle. So, Christological anthropology, or Christian anthropology, another way of saying that, is, like we said earlier, the idea or the being able to understand the human person in and through who Christ is, right? Only then will I know myself fully as a human person. And we take Jesus as our model of a human person and the fullness of humanity. And to know him, I have to study him, which is kind of what we're doing here, right? That's one way to get to know him. But John Paul says that's not enough, because I could study about Jesus all I want to. There could be an atheist studying Jesus, but have no relationship with him, right? No, John Paul says it's the encounter. I only get to know someone if I, like you did earlier, go up and introduce myself and tell stuff about me and spend time together, right? Think about your best friend in high school especially. This always works with my high school girls. I'm like, you know how when you're around somebody, like you make a new friend, but you become really good friends, and then all of a sudden you notice that you're like taking on some of their mannerisms? Whenever they're around, you speak with their accent, all right? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, why do we do that? And they're just like, I don't know. I'm like, because humans assimilate. Humans assimilate from others. We assimilate the other into ourselves because we're created for communion. And then I tell them, that's why your parents won't let you hang out with that friend, because they don't want you acting like her. That's why. Okay, anyway. All right, so that only happens in and through encounter, right? I tell my girls, I'm like, if you don't stop texting each other or Snapchatting, whatever you're doing, and actually go up to somebody and talk to them soon, right? You're never going to have the encounter where it changes you. The same is true with Jesus. If I'm studying and neglecting my prayer, I'm spinning my wheels. Adoration is one of my favorite ways to pray. I'll give you an example of this. And sometimes I'll take something to Jesus in adoration where I'm struggling in some way. Maybe it's a situation that happened or a conversation I had, and maybe it didn't go so well, or whatever, you know. I'll be thinking about it, or I'll be reading scripture and like trying to like meditate on that passage. And more often, I was gonna say once in a while, that's not true. Happens a lot. I feel like this mirror like rises in front of me, and Jesus is in the mirror, and then I look at myself, like my behavior, and he's like, that don't look like me. That don't look like me at all. And I'm like, whoops, okay, that was my fault. All my fault. Thank you, Jesus. It's whenever I have the encounter with him that he can start to show me myself, not only in my failures, but also how I'm like him. I can only take him, assimilate his thoughts, his behaviors, if I'm in relationship with him, where I'm encountering him. That's how I come to know myself, right? I have to encounter him. We can't only study him. And when we encounter him, what we find is what made his humanity perfect was his willing sacrifice of himself. I have loved you even unto death. He made a total gift of himself. That is what we're called to do. Make a total gift of ourselves. And that's why we look to him. Okay, I love the next principle. All right, this one's all about love. All right, so we see this is called hermeneutics of the gift. Hermeneutic, fancy word, means a method of analyzation. That's all it means. We use one every day, the scientific method. If you're in school, if you're teaching, if your kids are like working on it, they're going to use the scientific method to analyze evidence, right? Hermeneutics, that would be a hermeneutic, the scientific method. Okay, so that's what it means. John Paul wanted to define love for us. So he has something called the hermeneutics of the gift, right? And he said, first, before he says, let's think for a moment about, just turn to whoever's next to you. I want you to give me one example of what our culture is saying about what love is. Now, this could be, culture is media, politics, like what's enshrined in our laws, right? The common practice of people in our culture, that's what makes culture, okay? So to your partner, just turn to that person and give one example of what the culture is telling us about love, or what it is. If I love you, I'm gonna let you do whatever you want. And why don't you accept it? I'm gonna do whatever I want and you should accept it. And if you don't, you hate me. That's where our culture is right now, right? Okay, how do I feel? That's right. That's why they say people can also fall out of love, right? It's the definition of love that lets that be interchangeable, right? Or let that be the case. Lust, yes, always. I saw this video by Jason Everett. I'm sure y'all are familiar with him. He's awesome. And on this video, he says, he was talking to a young man, and the young man used the word bromance. Y'all remember when that term was popular a few years ago? And Jason Everett's like, why does that have to be a bromance? Why can't we just have a healthy masculine friendship? Like, if we're talking love in our culture, right, people automatically go to sex or romance. Like, that's something that happens a lot in our culture, right? But that's not how Jesus defined love in the Gospels, right? What's an example of how Jesus defined love in the Gospels? What? Sacrifice. What else? Love of neighbor. Service. Right? This looks really different, doesn't it? My favorite one is when Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. I tell that to my teenagers, and they're like, wait, Jesus has standards? I'm like, yeah, surprise! He loves you no matter what, but to be in a relationship with him, he's got standards, all right? So anyway, yeah, Jesus, that picture of love in the gospel is totally different, right? Well, for John Paul, to love means that I'm giving or making a gift of myself for another. Because, why? Because of Christian anthropology. Because that's who Jesus is. He gave himself out of love for us, right? That's who he is. So that's why John Paul defines it that way. But then he says, in our human experience, like Chad said earlier, the perfect personification of that in the visible world would be the spousal, which means they're what? Married. Love between a man and a woman is the perfect embodiment of giving of self in the visible world.